Okay, I'm organizing the lecture. I want to just spend a few minutes setting the stage, since I assume that most of you don't get up every morning and think about Ukraine. Especially since for many of us, of course, Ukraine has not been around as an independent state only since 1991. And we think of it as the Ukraine, that funny little place as part of the Soviet Union that has a seat at the UN. So I want to set the stage a little bit on that. And then I want to go straight into the costs of the war for both Russia and Ukraine. Talk a little bit about why did Russia invade, and then focus on this question of why the invasion has gone so badly for Russia. Let me just say, it took a lot of people by big surprise. Not so much the Ukrainians, I might add, but many other people had not been paying attention to what had been going on in Ukraine, especially since 2014. And then talk about scenarios for how the war will end. Okay, so let me, so the first issue is development of the Ukrainian state nation. I want to begin by making an obvious point that's very hard for people to grasp sometimes, and that is that there's nothing natural about the formation of nations and states. It's a byproduct of a whole bunch of historical processes, including, as I mentioned here, geography, national endowments, migration patterns, when there is a transition to settled agriculture rather than hunter and gatherer societies, ambitious leaders in war. Now, having said that, there's nothing natural about states or nations. They're constructed as an accident, in effect, of history. Ukraine evolved in an unusually turbulent neighborhood, and this was just like Eastern Europe. Western Europe had a much smoother transition to nation and statehood, in part because Eastern Europe absorbed the shocks from the East. It was like a sponge that protected Western Europe and allowed certain kinds of things to happen there. Okay, this is a map of Ukraine. This is the entire Ukraine today. And it just has dates when these portions were added. And I'm bringing that up because, you know, this is after the Bolsheviks seized power. This is the core historical formation of the Ukrainian state, semi-state. We wouldn't really call it a state. It didn't have the kind of state responsibilities and capabilities, but it had relatively stable borders. This is added by the Russian Empire. This is added as a deal, in effect, with the Soviet Union after the Second World War, where it got to expand. And this was added, and this is Crimea, and this was added in 1954. I'm showing you this map to show you that there was a rather piecemeal and complicated process of the development of the state we see today. And it took place, obviously, as I put here, not just over centuries, but even very recently, such as Crimea, such as this part of Ukraine here, which is really 1939 when the Nazis took over, 1945 when the Soviets took over. Okay, here I just want to give you some examples of the trauma and the turbulence, really, of the development of the Ukrainian state. So this gives you the first one. Let me just read it to you. Without moving a single time, a person residing in Lviv, which is in Western Ukraine, who lived there from 1913 to 1993, lived in 7 states from 1913 to 1993. In other words, that person would tell someone all the places that he had been, and then they would say, boy, you traveled a lot. And he said, I never moved. And so you have Austria-Hungary, you have Imperial Russia, you have something called the West Ukrainian People's Republic, which was a short space in the during the revolution, Bolshevik Revolution, Poland, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, Ukraine. In other words, the state address changed every 11 years. This Ukraine, the map before, with the full borders that we see today, is 31 years. That's really long by Ukrainian standards to have been with the same borders and have the same name for 31 years. The second example is Holodomor, which you may have heard of, which was a Stalin-created famine in Ukraine during collectivization. which a variety of very good work has shown was purposive rather than a byproduct of stupid public policy in the Kremlin, in which approximately 4 million people died, which is to say they starved to death, died of starvation and the like. A third comes from Tim Snyder, whom you may have seen on TV. I recommended later on as someone that you might want to follow up, read his various pieces. But Hitler's plan for Ukraine, and this is to recreate the US antebellum system of slavery. That was his plan, was to enslave Ukraine because it is the breadbasket, essentially the equivalent of cotton in the South. And finally, I want to mention Ukraine's current neighbors, and of which there are quite a few. But what I want you to notice about this is Russia, Belarus, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Moldova, Romania, is how new all these states are. Hungary is actually the oldest in terms of its current borders, from 1920. So this is a picture of Ukraine, again, giving you a sense of, the kind of ways in which it touches on so many different states. Right away, that introduces a lot of security issues for Ukraine. Okay. Now, let me turn to just looking at, there were 2 interventions in Ukraine by the Russians recently. And that is to say 2014, and of course, the one we've seen since February this year, 2022. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the 2014 invasion because it really set in motion a lot of things that are affecting the war today, and among other things, Russian gigantic miscalculations about its invasion. Okay, late 2013, there was an outbreak of huge and long-lasting protests. What happened is that the dictator at that time, he wasn't really a dictator, but he had dictatorial tendencies. He was elected. And by the way, he and Donald Trump had the same campaign manager. So that's an important thing to know. Paul Manafort. He had promised when he ran for office in 2012 that he would support Ukraine becoming closer to Europe, not to NATO, no, European Union, and improve ties between Ukraine and Europe, even though he was in Putin's pocket. It's what he did to get elected, in effect. Well, he turned away from that option when an opportunity presented itself, not to join the EU, but rather a much looser arrangement that had to do with an associate membership that required nothing actually of the EU, but it was a first step. He said no. He said he put it off and refused to go along with it, and huge protests broke out, and they lasted for months. Then things got very, very, very tense, and the regime killed some of the protesters in February 2014. Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, realized that absolute turmoil had broken out. Many of the people advising him had been fleeing, resigning, etc. And what he did was he quickly fled to Russia, which is exactly where you expected him to flee because he was practically in Putin's pocket, as I said. Russia, having lost Yanukovych, in other words, having lost its ability to influence what goes on in Ukraine because it controlled the president, then decided to invade. It began by invading Crimea first, in the far south, the Crimea Peninsula. For those of you who are history buffs, among other things, that's where Yalta is located, which was the great post-war settlement of Eastern Europe, the Yalta Conference. So Russia responded and invaded Crimea, but it didn't really invade Crimea. It didn't use its military. It used people dressed in funny little outfits. They were called the Green Men. And everyone knew who they were, but it wasn't an official Russian military uniform. And right away, they held a referendum, and that referendum led to rapid annexation of that area. Let me see if I can go. That area that I mentioned here, Crimea. What's interesting about that annexation is that accidentally Putin has had at that time an assistant who was the representative for human rights. That person published the results of the decision about the referendum to decide on the fate of Crimea, whether it would stay in Ukraine or whether it would go to Russia. And in fact, the election was very, very close. That person lost their job very quickly. That posting, disappeared very fast, and Putin declared that it was a massive support within Crimea. The only reason it got some support, which is really pretty important, is that Crimea had changed in terms of its population structure, and it had a lot more Russians in it than it had historically. Historically, the Crimean Tatars, which was a Khanate in the Ottoman Empire, the Crimean Tatars were the dominant nation, but Stalin killed a lot of them. Believe me, killed a lot of them and exported many of them to Kazakhstan during the Second World War. Stalin did that a lot because he was afraid that, in fact, the people on the fringes of the Soviet Union would not defend Russia and would defect. And so the population had changed, and so there were some votes there to get. Recent migrants from Russia. The Crimean Tatars, of course, didn't support it. Okay, then Putin decided to take over and have an indirect invasion. In this case, what's kind of known as a destabilization hybrid warfare approach in the eastern part of Ukraine. Let me just put up this thing a little bit so you see where we are. We're really talking about like right here. Okay, this area here. So that's called the Donbass. And he launched this hybrid warfare. And what that really was about was the use of Russian thugs, same Russian thugs that had tried to destabilize Bosnia. The same group. It was really interesting. I mean, these were people that were sent to a lot of different places in various points. Russian thugs, false charges. He made false charges of discrimination against the Russian-speaking minority, instigated fake unrest, and expanded Russian control over the local media and schools. So what's happening here, and again, we're not in 2014, what's happening here is what Putin is doing is trying to, he can't control Ukraine because he lost Yanukovych. He's going to destabilize it. And then he's going to, in the process, take the easiest apple to pick, which is Crimea, and annex it to Russia. As for the Donbass, he knows he can't really move it there very easily. And so what he does is that he makes it so unstable, it is dysfunctional. And turmoil results, and there are a series there's a lot of violence. And what happens, this is another, so this is the area, these are the two areas in 2014 that Putin chooses to take over. This he took over directly, this he just destabilized. Okay, so what happens is 2015 is there's something called the Minsk Accords because it was signed in Belarus. And they put some limits on the war, but the fighting continued from 2014 to 2022. So don't think of this as ending the war and then another war starts 12 years. Now, there were something like 14,000 people who died in that first war, this 2014 war. And I just make a comparison here to give you an idea, because it's sad whoever dies, but in Northern Ireland, from 69 to 2003, 3,720 people were killed. You compare that with Ukraine, 14,000. This was a very, very bloody war. It is all in that area of the Donbass that I showed you. Okay, the Minsk Accords were not successful because basically they offered two promises to the different combatants. The first promise was essentially to Ukraine, make the region more autonomous than it had been. In other words, let it have more local governance, more control over language policy, more control over social policy, but remain within the state of Ukraine. The Russians, of course, interpreted it as a region that is independent of Ukraine and tied to Russia. So it wasn't exactly the basis for common understanding of what to do with this region. This is just a quick map of the protocol. What they had basically was a ceasefire. And this part is fully typically governed in the way Ukraine is usually governed. And this was the area that was going to be either autonomous within Ukraine, as I said before, or be part of Russia. So this was a ceasefire, but it never worked as a ceasefire. It just never worked. The war kept starting up again. Okay, now I say Russia invades again, and this is the one the one that we're familiar with now, 2022. In 2022, this is a real military operation. You know, this is not sneaky warfare, destabilization, etc. This is a real military operation. It's a very peculiar situation because it began with a military attack by the Russians on the capital of Ukraine, and which you may remember was a complete fiasco. A complete fiasco. I mean, it did not work. And by early summer, Russia realized that it couldn't just pick off stuff. Let me give you a little bit of a, trying to think. Okay, so the Russians decide coming here, this is Kiev, sorry, this is not, it's a different translation. This is Kiev, and as we have called it, so they try to go after there, and they're very interested in going after this area if they can, but this area is kind of close to where they think they already have control. So they're coming down, and they're using Belarus, which is Lukashenko's domain, very close to Putin. Essentially, Belarus is a part of Russia. I mean, he gave up almost all of his autonomy some time ago. So they're using that. This fails. They never succeed in really controlling this area. And what's interesting here, just take a minute. It's interesting about Kharkiv. It's the second largest city in Ukraine, but it's a very heavily Russian-speaking place. This area in general, as you might, let me do a little bit on language for a minute. So this is more Russian-speaking. This, by the way, is where Zelensky is from. This is where he was born, and this is part of the Russian heartland. So he grew up with Russian as his first language. And when you get more towards here, you get Ukrainian speaking, but you also have a Sperm language, which is a mixture. So it's Russian Ukrainian. And it's a very specific kind of language. And then over here, there's no Russian. You know, I mean, people move, so of course there are exceptions to that. But over here, there is no Russian. A place like Lviv, which I mentioned, had been in so many states, they had never been really in the Russian Empire. They were in Poland, they were in Slovakia, they were, you name it, they were all over the place, but they were never there. And so you don't see any Russian speaking in this part of Ukraine. This is pretty much through here, you know, Ukrainian speaking first, and this is more Russian. Now, having said that, and this is hard for people to understand because it's a counter to the way we think about a lot of national identities. And I'll talk about that a bit later. National identities of these Russian speakers is for the most part Ukrainian. The language does not tell you how they identify. It merely says that that's the language that they spoke when they were young. If you look at young people in Ukraine, they don't know Russian at all. You know, because there's been no reason for it. So language is not the predictor of identity. It's just language. And so while you have some Russian dominant speakers who could identify and will identify with Russia, number one, there are fewer and fewer of those. But number two, they're a minority within the Russian speakers. So it's a very different, because of this turbulent history I mentioned, and because by Ukrainian standards, 31 years as an independent state is truly an amazing accomplishment. Compared with what's happened historically, it's incredible. And Ukrainians take that accomplishment pretty serious. It's their state. They may speak Russian to each other in some cases, but they don't think they live in Russia. They think they live in Ukraine and they identify as Ukrainian. So it's a little bit, I understand, complicated for people to kind of figure that out. Okay, so then we getting back to 2022. By early summer, Russia switches, as I said, to a grinding war in the south and in the northeast. So what they're trying to do is extend the Donbass area and go to the underbelly to Crimea. And they're trying to make it go north as well to include Kharkiv. So they're going to go in both directions. They make fairly slow progress. You may remember or may have read about the occupation of Mariupol after they completely destroyed it and everybody in it, as well as Kherson. One of the two reasons why last week was so great, aside from the election, was liberation of Kherson by Ukrainian forces. It was a huge, huge breakthrough moment. I'm sorry, what? Oh, they can't hear me. Okay, so I have this. Okay. I've been grounded. Okay. Yeah, I'll just do. Okay. Is it okay if I turn around like that? They still know that I. Okay. Just want to get it straight. So Russia fails to take what it needs to take. And of course, it still has Mariupol, but it loses Kherson. Losing the Kherson is very important because Russia annexed Kherson. So whoops, you know, it just lost the state that the city that it annexed, the regional capital. Now, in September, Ukraine launches a counteroffensive. Russia is on the run, loses key cities, as I mentioned, definitively so, Kharkiv and Kherson. And Kherson is very important because it's the gateway to Crimea. Very, very important. It also is where the water runs to Crimea. So, because Crimea has some wells and things like that, but they're very dependent, especially for their agriculture, on water coming from the rest of Ukraine. It's where the main electrical grid goes in. So Kherson is a very, very, very important thing. So this gives you, this is a map. Can I go over to the map? You think I'm allowed to one? Okay. This is the map. Okay, so this is the station that Russia has won in the war. And that's about right now. And this is what Ukraine has taken back in the group. And so this is since the counteroffensive started in September. I never know when you give lectures like this how much you're into the military stuff, but anyway, this is maybe an easier to see map that shows you a similar thing. So one of the interesting things is that Russia failed to take Odessa. Odessa is really the jewel of the crown. It's not only a very, very important port, but it is an incredibly beautiful city. It's also the home of many, many, many of the most important Russian and Ukrainian and especially Jewish writers of the 19th and 20th century. It has streets. They're named things like Tolstoy. It's an absolutely incredible place. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears. That's kind of an overview of the war. So Ukraine is on the move. Ukraine is looking very good. A key question, of course, is the winter and what's going to happen in the winter. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, the cost of war for Ukraine. 15 million people have fled from homes and 8 million refugees. About 30% of Ukraine's pre-war population is either abroad or internally displaced. So we're talking about a huge, huge, hugely disruptive process. Chairman Milley, I don't know to trust this estimate or not. There are a lot of estimates floating around. Has said very recently that well over 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed or wounded. Ukraine does not give accurate data on what happens, but neither does Russia. You know, Russia's lost nobody, according to Russia. I mean, 6,000, they said. That was one of their latest numbers. About 30,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed. The World Bank has estimated the damage so far $150 billion. Clear evidence of Russian war crimes against Ukrainians. The data are already being gathered and have been gathered. Purposeful, by that I mean the purpose of targeting of civilians, and of course what the Russians are especially doing now with the winter approaching is infrastructure. You know, freeze them to death, starve them to death, give them no water. Now, genocide. What I wanted to do here is just lay out that according to the 1948 Genocide Convention, there are certain kinds of standards for establishing genocide. What is incredible about this war, there are a lot of incredible things, is that this is one of the purest, closest cases we have of genocide. Why? They're trying to destroy the Ukrainian nation. That is the point, not just control the state, but every place they take over, they outlaw the Ukrainian language, they force people to speak Russian, they force people to switch Orthodoxy to the Russian Orthodox Church, not the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And I'm sure you've read in the news periodically, they send children back to Russia to be adopted by Russians, to be raised in a correct Russian home. This is genocide. This is genocide the way it has been. I can see all this, the murder, bodily, and some are all destruction of their ability to live normally, and forcible transfer of children to another group. It's right out of it. Of this, there is no doubt. It's just how far, how bad, how much. So what they want to do, I said, is extinguish the Ukrainian nation. Now, the human costs of war in Russia. Of course, no Russian civilians have been forced to leave their homeland. The fighting's all been in Ukraine. But an estimated probably, this is also very tough, very, very vague. I give you these numbers, but don't get too hooked on how accurate they are. It's very, very hard to say. Roughly speaking, about 900,000 to 1,500,000 Russians have fled to neighboring countries. These could be people against the war. They can be reactions to the sanctions. They can be avoiding the draft because there's been a recent round of a big conscription. So what's also very important to remember is that the brain drain in Russia has been astonishing. Their most educated, their most technical people, certainly their most urban people have been the ones that have fled. They have the capacity to flee, and they also have the belief that there's no future for them if they stay in Russia. Milley again says over 100,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded. Russia claims, yeah, up to 10,000. But what's really stunning about this is only since February of this year. The Afghan war that Russia was involved in, 14,000 Russians died over a 10-year period. And the two Chechen wars, 5,000 over a 5-year period. So the amount of human cost for the Russians, obviously for the Ukrainians, but we should not side. We should also note that in terms of the Russian soldiers, especially the ones that had to go to the worst parts of the front, there's a disproportionate number of rural populations and minorities killed, people that need money and live far from Moscow. The other thing that's really amazing is that a lot of the regions of Russia have very powerful governors who have protected their people going to war. Some don't, especially the minority regions do not have strong governors. And so what's happened is that those places have been, in effect, conduits to go straight to the front. I'm sure you've seen some of these articles about how bad, how limited the training is, how poorly they're prepared, so they're just thrown in. The political economic costs, I'm worried about time here, but more than 50 countries have participated in the sanctions regime. And what's really, I think, interesting is that the sanctions have paid costs everywhere from 3 to 6% decline in in GDP this year. It's going to hit bad next year, because they've had such a brain drain, number one. Number two, they are more and more and more closed off, and they depend on the outside world. They're not self-sufficient in technology. They rely on the outside world for the technology, and much of their technological needs are only going to be met by countries that ally with the West. So, you know, you want to ask, okay, well, okay, they're cozy with China. China will not help them in a lot of ways. They can't. And so this is going to be growing difficulty. It's going to also affect their ability to wage war in Ukraine. They don't have spare parts. And those spare parts are really made in the West. So there's growing pressures on Putin as a result of war failures. We all know that Russia has a history of war failures leading to unrest. The Crimean War, the Russo-Japanese War, World War I, and the First Chechen War. The Russians have come up with completely ridiculous justifications for attacking Ukraine. They started, and this is what they tell their soldiers, they started by saying there were a bunch of Nazis there, Nazis who elected a Jewish president. It's an interesting pattern. Biolabs, you know, dirty bombs, Satanists. They're really big on Satanists right now. This is one of their favorite things. And then you have that, what Lavrov, the foreign minister, said, of squabbles within a Slavic family that Russia needs to settle. They don't really have a rationale for this. I'll talk about it in a moment on this. Another problem is another cost undermining Russian national security. Russia has the 5th largest military in the world. With NATO expansion, by the way, NATO is twice as large. Both the Swedish and the Finnish militaries are quite large and quite sophisticated. It's a massive addition. The incompetence of the Russian military has been exposed for all to see. They have growing international isolation. The most important thing in this to me is that Russia's alliances are crumbling. And I'm not sure how long the situation with Belarus is going to go on. But, you know, in terms of being allied with Russia, because I expect Belarus will fall apart at some point fairly soon. Who knows when? Things are hard to predict. But major powers in Central Asia, like Kazakhstan, you know, in other words, former members of the Soviet space before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia was able to guarantee that it would be the dominant player within that group. No longer. They're all looking the other way. Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan. They're all looking the other way. They're all distancing themselves. And so Russia, actually, I mean, it's really incredible how stupid this has been. Not just cruel, not just wrong, not just unjust, not just illegal, et cetera, but stupid. It's had enormous costs. China and India they're not saying they're against them, but they, both the Prime Minister of India and Xi of China said in public, you know, that this war is not going well for Russia. You need to think about this. So there's a lot of strains within. Now, the core of Putin's vision of what he wants from this is a thing called the Russian world. Ruski Mir. And that Russian world's in big trouble. Think about this for a moment. One of the members of the Russian world faces massive draft dodging, economic disruptions, and movements of internal sabotage. That's Russia. One is being destroyed by Russia while moving much closer to the West, Ukraine. And one is led by a Putin ally who has faced massive unrest and internal sabotage of war effort. So far, it's provided staging areas for Russia, not a single soldier to the military invasion. They have resisted this. It's obvious that Putin's ability to have a Russian world is going to be at best Russia, the Russian world. But what else? It doesn't look good. The ironic consequences of the Russian attack. This is where I think we get into the kind of stupidity deeply. West is more united than it's been for a long time. NATO is bigger. Ukrainian anger against Russia Public opinion is up, support for democracy is up, support for joining the EU and NATO is up, and identity as a citizen of Ukraine is way up. In other words, they have created an antagonist. They have created someone who wants as much distance from them as possible. So, put differently, the Russian invasion means that Russia's been very successful at building Ukrainian identity, rallying Ukrainians around their state, democracy, and Zelensky, and driving Ukraine away from Russia and into the arms of the West. Incredibly dumb, incredibly counterproductive, incredibly undermining of any kind of Russian security. Now, why did Russia invade Ukraine? I'm not going to go through all these. Let's just say Ukrainian Nazis, these are all pretty goofy arguments in a lot of different ways, and I don't want to work through all of them, but Ukrainian Nazis are taking over Ukraine, a threat to Russian national security. It was about to join NATO, it wasn't. Ukraine provoked Russia by forcing a coup. You see this sometimes in some of the more bizarre conspiracy theories, even in the United States, about, I think Marjorie Trader Green is the one that likes this one. And, you know, it's about Ukraine provoked Russia by having a coup against Yanukovych. Yanukovych was scared out of his mind and ran to Russia. He had nowhere else to go. Ukraine is hostile to Russian speakers and identifiers? No. The West isolated Russia early in the Cold War. That's a complicated story, but it's not really right. At certain options in terms of making deals with a kind of different kind of membership with NATO, that could have been done. It was floated to Russia. They turned it down. And also that Zelensky is anti-Russia. Ridiculous. He came from the Russian-speaking heartland, speaks Russian fluently, grew up in Russian, knows Russian literature, et cetera. So he is hostile to Russia now, I will tell you. Okay, good answers. Why did Russia invade? Well, the first thing is what I call diffusion proofing. Putin is afraid that if you have stable, productive democracies around the Russian border, that Russians will get the idea that they should do the same. It's protecting this dictatorship from the virus of the neighborhood of democracies. So he's trying to stop the diffusion of democracy into the Russian court. Number two, it's a rally around the flag. Putin's popularity was going down in 2014 when he added Crimea as a republic of Russia. His popularity went up. He's never gotten over what a great thing that was. You know, so it's a rally around the flag phenomenon. But it's also, and I think this is in some ways the most important one, which gets us from the realm of real politics into the realm of ideology and vision that a leader has. Putin had a colonial vision and has had a colonial vision for quite a while. He has said out loud, you know, the quiet part out loud, as we keep hearing about other people, Ukraine is not a nation or a state. It's critical to unite Slavs in one country. It's critical to build a Russian world to counter the West. You know, why not a Belarusian world, a Ukrainian world? But no, it's a Russian world you have to build to counter the West. Okay, this is why, you know, go on to why is the war gone so badly? This is one of the, you must have seen these pictures early in the war of Ukrainian peasants using tractors to pick up Russian military equipment, such as tanks. It was a wonderful whole group of these things. Okay, so why did it go badly? The Russian military, of course, was much bigger than Ukrainian military, but badly organized, rigid, corrupt, weak on logistics, very weak, top heavy, soldiers thrown into battle without training, equipment briefing, and also Russia is fighting abroad, not at home. You know, it's funny, it's odd to me. When they sent the soldiers in, and they're still doing this, they don't, unlike the US military, tell them what the mission is and why. This is what you are going to be doing, and this is why you should be doing it. They would say things like, we got to rout out the Nazis. What are the Nazis? I mean, you know. But he didn't ever, in effect, take the responsibility of saying this is the purpose. And when the soldiers get there, they can't figure it out. You know, they can't figure out what are they doing there, what's the purpose of this, etc. But anyway, it's a very, very It's a very screwed up military. That's all there is to it. They tried to reform about 20 years ago, and it just stepped on too many important toes to get a more modern style military. And they stopped that one right away. Okay, part of the answer is bad information, why Russia has done so badly. This is the problem with dictatorship. Underlings tell you what you want to hear. If you tell them what you don't want to hear, bad things happen to you. So you create a kind of an echo chamber. And here's to me the biggest and most important thing that obviously Putin was told, that nothing had changed in Ukraine since 2014. The idea, I'll show you some charts in a moment, the idea that nothing happened after 2014 in Ukraine. What happened was a really sharp decline in corruption. What happened was several rounds of massive civil society protests, demonstrations, etc. Lots of things happened. Growing Ukrainian identity, really growing. Much stronger Ukrainian support for democracy, much stronger sense of Ukrainian, and also, as I put in here, US training of Ukrainian military happened. It's like Putin was frozen in time in 2014. Not that he was that well advised then, but by 2022, he was really poorly advised. The Russian military was larger and therefore more effective. This is an old communist thing, you know, the bigger, the more effective it is. You know, so if you want to make nails, you make one nail that weighs 7,800 pounds. You know, doesn't matter if it doesn't fit anything. And so there is this mentality of big is better, rather than the quality of the military. Now, thirdly, the West, Putin thought the West would respond as it did in 2014, appeasement. That's what we did. We said, oh, well, we don't like what you're doing in Crimea. We don't like what you're doing in Donbass, but you know, okay, whatever. It's important to keep that in mind because Putin thought that was the way the West was. The stupidest and strangest thing is that Putin thought that Ukrainians were eager to join Russia. And they weren't. There were some, of course. But keep in mind that every time Putin does one thing, like in Crimea, he promised a tripling of social welfare expenditures if they voted to join Russia. He promised them all kinds of things, you know, if they would vote for it. We all know now that maybe they voted for it, maybe they didn't. Okay, this is you don't need to see the details, but to say, I think this is, I'm supposed to stay over here. This is looking at Ukrainian support for democracy over time. So this is public opinion data. And what you should look at is this, because what happens is that there's this transformation of how Ukrainians think about things. And part of the reason for that is that at this point, roughly speaking, 32% of Ukrainians' population was born since independence. They don't have a Soviet past. They don't have any of that. They have grown up in an independent Ukraine. Okay, this is Ukrainian views of Russia, and the pardon me? Yeah. Okay. I'll do that. Okay, so this is anyway. What this is just showing, I'll race through. What this is showing is that this is good views of Russians is blue. The brown is bad. Not surprisingly, the brown goes way up. But in all these charts, this is, by the way, another thing that's important. I'll just say really fast. Why do I have this chart up here? This is a 1990 referendum at the end of the Soviet Union about whether to have an independent Ukraine. And the only reason I put this up is what's really interesting about this. These are all the counties. There's not a single county in Ukraine, including Crimea, that voted against it. Independence was supported by all, you know, a huge percentage of the Ukrainian population, even in the Russian areas. So that was the beginning of the end of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Okay, quick. Part of the answer is the West, and the West has done an enormous amount. All I can say has been an incredibly impressive move by the Biden administration in how they have handled this, how they've handled NATO, how they've handled the Western reaction. Joe Biden it's easy to underestimate that man. And he keeps surprising us in the ways that we'd like to be surprised. And so that's something. Okay. So the West learned from 2014. I'll race through this. What I want to do is spend a little bit of time now on Zelensky, because obviously one of the reasons Ukraine has done so well is Zelensky. And he has an interesting background. This is their support for his election. But here's a picture of him. Here's a picture of him with the troops. And here's a picture. This is the Vogue picture. You might have seen that with his wife. But this is what I hope I can get this to work. Zelensky won Dancing with the Stars in 2006. There he is.